Hi, I'm KS Garner, and you're listening to the Solo Nerd Podcast. Today, I'll be speaking with the craftsman behind the Shadow Bindery, Elizabeth McHugh, here to discuss her specialties in book binding and book repairs. Welcome, Liz.
Thank you. I'm excited to be here.
Well, thank you for reaching out to me. And I believe you said we met at Baltimore Comic-Con, right?
Yeah.
So how was that for you?
It was good. It was my first experience as a vendor with the bindery. So I graduated from bookbinding school in 2019, and I was supposed to start in 2020, and obviously that didn't happen because of the pandemic. So this is the first time I got out there. I was really excited about it.
So they have a school for this? I didn't know that.
Yeah, so there's 2 full-time programs left in the country. The one that I went to is in North Bennett Street School. It's in Boston. There's another one in Telluride, Colorado. It's called the American Bookbinding School. Don't quote me on that. I think that's it, but I can't remember the full title. So yeah, there are a couple of full-time programs. And then there's smaller schools that offer weekend workshops or week-long workshops. You can definitely find them everywhere. There's some online programs you can get. They'll send you a bookbinding kit, if you want to sort of get into it and get started. So there are options.
Okay, cool. We'll get more into what inspired you, I guess, to start the Shadow Bindery and getting into bookbinding. But outside my introduction, who is Elizabeth McHugh in her own words?
I'm like an epic nerd. I know that's sort of broad, but not only with the bookbinding, I got into it, because of history, and because I'm an artist, but in terms of the Shadow Bindery doing this, it really is because I love the nerd culture, and that comes with the comic books and graphic novels and cosplay, manga. I like it all. So this is sort of how I engage with it. You know what I mean?
So I guess what inspired the Shadow Bindery, I guess, outside of being a nerd? I mean, that goes along with being a nerd of everything. So what inspired all of this for you to start it?
So originally when I went into school, my plan was to eventually go into a master's program in art conservation with a focus in books. And these are the people that fix up Gutenberg's Bible, and they fix up Shakespeare's first portfolio. They take the historical documents, like in a National Treasure, when he steals the Declaration of Independence, he steals it from the conservation room, and that's where they would repair it. So I was originally that was the big plan. And I went to North Bennett Street School sort of as an intermediary educational step towards that, because they teach book repair and they teach some conservation techniques. And I realized it wasn't for me. I was like, oh crap, this is not for me. Conservationists spend a lot of time repairing paper, and a lot of the attitude or the prevailing philosophy in conservation is not to change the object that you're working on because of historical reasons. You want to preserve it. That is the goal, right? But for me, when I see something that's broken or needs repair, I want to restore it. I want to change it. I want to bring it back to the way it looked, and I want to go all in. So it's sort of I had to struggle with that, and at that point it was okay, well then what do? You're in this bookbinding program for 2 years. What are you going to do with it? And so we went through this part of the curriculum where we learned to, take books and sort of remake them. And it sort of really is like cosplay for books. You take these books and you can totally change the cover design, and you can change the edging, you can do all these really cool things. And it just clicked. And I was like, this is what I want to do. I want to make these books spectacular. I want your version of Harry Potter to look like it came from Hogwarts, and that was what excited me. And so that's sort of where it started.
So I guess, can you, elaborate on your creative process as a bookbinder? Would that be correct? A bookbinder or a book repair person? How does someone get in contact with you if they wanted a book repaired or bound?
So in terms of like contact, like I have, like a Facebook page and an Instagram. My email is listed. It's theshadowbindery@gmail.com. So like one word. And they can, reach out through social media or through my email. That's not an issue. But in terms of like process, so it depends on whether it's like a repair or if I'm doing like a commission. A lot of people, because this is not something that people are familiar with, you know what I mean? It is sort of like this lost art. They don't even know their options. And so a lot of the initial contact is finding out like what they want, what they have seen, and trying to like get an idea of what they really want their book to look like at the end. So last summer I got a commission from a family that they had like a children's book, and they really just wanted it restored. The book had fallen apart, it was a kid's book, and they had used tape to sort of tape the pages back in. They were falling out. It was very sad looking. And the covers had started coming off, and so that really, like, I dismembered the book completely. I had to clean each page individually. I had to put them all back together, and then I had to rebuild the spine of that book. And it was a great piece. It was like a lot of fun to do. It came out really good. They were super happy. That's part of their family history. So that was like a really cool project for me. This past summer, I had a woman that I've done a couple jobs for. She sent me her signed copy of The Name of the Wind by Patrick Rothfuss.
Oh.
And the spine had broke. And the book wasn't in bad shape, but like the spine had broke. And so she was like, well, since it's broken, you're going to, fix it anyway. Can you give me a new cover? And so I did. I built her a new cover that had this really beautiful Italian book cloth, and on the spine, it was all black. And then this really cool paper, this decorative paper that had this wind design. And it just sort of, it made sense for that book. So she was really happy, and I was really happy. And that's like, it's like sort of the best part of my job when, I can finish these things and hand them back, and people are like, oh my God, this is the best thing.
Uh-huh.
But if we're talking about like, so I have an Etsy shop as well. Yeah. And I'll just do, stuff like the stuff that I brought to Baltimore Comic-Con. And I have some here behind me. I have examples. I just finished Batman and Wonder Woman. And, like, this is a full leather binding. It's custom made, obviously. And I built the cover. I did all the marble papers on the inside. So these are all like unique and hand done. And this will last a couple hundred years. You know what I mean? Like,
yeah. So how do you, I guess, build a new cover? Like, how does that work?
So, like with any sort of project, I'll start with an initial design, and that I'll sketch it out. That could depend on what we're talking about. If we're talking about Batman, obviously I'm going to have the Batman logo in there, and this is called Arkham City. That's the graphic novel. So I wanted the city skyline in there. And once I sort of have an idea of what I'm going to do, I'll acquire all the materials. So for this, I actually bought this. The leather on it is sheepskin, but I bought it specifically because it was already pre-distressed, so it sort of had that really nice texture to it. And like those choices you really have to make, at least for bookbinding, most of them you have to make up front, because a lot of work that goes into the book goes into it before you ever put the cover on. So if you decide to decorate the edges of the book, so something that's becoming really popular is 4-edge painting. Have you heard of this?
No.
Okay, so it's easier on regular novels because they're just a bit thicker, like there's just more real estate to work with. But people will take a book, they'll clamp the crap out of it, they'll clamp it really hard, and they'll paint a scene of the book on the 3 available edges that you have of the pages. Is
that what? Okay, yeah. When you describe it, I know what you're talking about.
Yeah, you see it, right? It's gaining a lot of popularity, and this is like an ancient technique. And again, something you could take classes in, which is pretty cool. But like there are other ways to decorate the edge. So you've seen Bibles have been gilded, or they'll have that red decoration.
Yeah.
But you can sort of put any color you want on it. You can put black, green, but it doesn't matter. You can sprinkle it, which is like sort of a traditional technique. But for me, I have to make that decision before I even start really with the binding, because I need to decorate the edge before I put the cover on, because I don't want any of the paint to get on the cover itself. So I'll bring in the book, I'll do a sketch, I'll strip it of its original cover. And for me, I'll go through all my planning stages, I'll acquire the materials, and then I'll really sort of get into it. I reline all the books that I have with a better spine lining.
Mm-hmm.
Most of the books are glued, like that's how they were bound commercially. Sometimes that glue has to be stripped out. Sometimes it's really crappy glue. Sometimes I'll leave it. It depends on the book, and sort of it's a case-by-case situation. If it's an older book, like a really old book, that glue typically is animal product, and it can be like removed. And you sort of want to remove it because it becomes really smelly, but also really like it'll crack and just sort of like fall off. It's kind of really gross.
Uh-huh.
But obviously, like, we are talking about a book, and the spine is one of the most important pieces. You want that structurally sound. So all the books that come through, regardless of their stage or their age, I will go in and I'll reline the spine and make sure that is stable before sort of proceeding. And then I usually add the end papers, which are those decorative papers right on the inside that attach to the covers. And on a lot of modern books, like it's not something that people pay attention to. Usually it's blank, it's like a white page, sometimes it'll be like a different color. But like in traditional bookbinding, it was sort of like an art statement. And so that's why like I like to make it an art statement,
Yeah.
And then like, once that's done, I'll start building the cover. There are two basic ways to do it. You can attach the boards on the book and then like start covering it in leather and cover it in paper and doing it with the text block in there. And that's like sort of risky because, you can get glue in there. You can there are things that could happen. Or you could build the cover off the book. And that's definitely for beginners. Like that's definitely safer. And sometimes that's easier. It just depends on the situation and like, again, the materials that you're working with.
Yeah. So I see, like you just said, you mentioned you have the Batman one that you built, and then there's a Wonder Woman one as well. How do you, people commissioning for that type of work with trademark like stuff. So how does that work in a way? You have, obviously people know the Batman symbol, people know Wonder Woman symbol and stuff like that. So are there legal issues with people commissioning for stuff like that? Like, how does that work?
I'm not sure. I've never run into it.
Uh-huh.
For me, I'm not taking credit for creating those symbols. You know what I mean? And I'm not certainly taking any credit for what's inside the book. Like the content of the book is obviously legally owned by those creators, those illustrators. And in all like my product descriptions, I will cite that because, again, I'm not taking credit for that. Mm-hmm. I am taking credit for the creation of like the binding. And so it's like the outside covering. It's sort of like, taking a shoe, like a ked or like a basketball shoe and painting on it on Etsy. You're not saying that you built the shoe. That's not what everybody knows it's a ked or whatever it is, you're saying that you did the design on top of it. And so like for me, for the Wonder Woman, like I bought this logo. Obviously, this is not something that I manufactured. And you can see in my process on my Instagram, because I document all that. Like I said, I wanted this to look like the trademarked version of DC. Mm-hmm. So it's just almost like an applique that I added.
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
Yeah.
So yeah, that's how I handle it.
Cool. Well, what is the most difficult aspect of your craft? Is it the craft itself? Is it advertising for it? Is it working with maybe some indecisive, impatient customers? Customers who want complicated designs but don't want to pay complicated design money, or like in your
Uh,
experience, what's the most complicated aspect?
right now, it is sort of like the education of people. Like even at Baltimore Comic-Con, I this is not something that you see very often. Most bookbinders deal in repair and restoration, so they don't really do a lot of like what I do. And so a lot, like, people would just walk by and they didn't realize that, like, they thought they were journals. A lot of people expected them to be blank. And so like at the end, I'd be like, no, they're not blank, they're the actual books, I promise. And then people would slow down and be like, oh, that's really interesting. And so it's just sort of just trying to educate people on that this is possible, that you can do this. And then sort of the next step is educating them on like the price tag, which for a lot of people is shocking. But like, this is like a handcraft, and sometimes I'm dealing with gold leaf or leather, like especially with inflation, you don't even talk about that, but the cost of leather is crazy right now. And I can use vegan leather, and like I have like alternatives, but like if you're going to go out and do this and you're not vegan or whatever, then like you're going to want real leather. Like that's sort of part of the appeal, is like that old book smell. So that's been really interesting and challenging. What is really exciting, especially for the craft, is that the bookbinding community is obviously not huge. It's a pretty specific type of book nerd that gets involved, but it is really developing and evolving in really fascinating ways. So book artists and that's becoming a much bigger thing over the last 10 years. You have like the younger generation have started things like the hashtag "Are you book enough?" And every year they come out with a list for that year of a theme per month that like internationally book artists around the world engage in. And so they'll decide, oh, I'm going to participate this month, and whatever that theme is, whether that's spring or fire or like whatever, they'll create a unique book throughout that month and then post it at the end. And you have thousands of people engaging in that. That's like really cool. There's also the fanfic community has really gotten into it recently, which for me is really exciting to see, because it's similar to what I do. But like they are such a strong community, and they've figured out or found out that there's no resources for them to print these fanfic works. These Draco and Hermione is like a really popular fanfic,
Yeah.
And that's the one I've seen the most of, but not just Harry Potter. I mean, there's a whole bunch of them out there. A friend of mine writes a whole bunch for what is it, Pitch Perfect, for
Oh yeah.
the two female leads. You know what I mean? So, but like, there's nobody out there to print them. Not only for copyright issues, you sort of it gets a little iffy or gray area, but just like your options are to go to Staples and get it printed and then like bound like a presentation book. Like nobody wants that. You want a book that you can put on your bookshelf and that looks attractive because you love this story, like regardless of where it came from, or if it's canon, quote unquote, like these people, this is like a big thing for them. And so a lot of them have just gone out and sort of figured out, either through workshops or online classes, the basics of bookbinding, and they've started doing it themselves, and it is so cool to see. Like, and some of the work is really fantastic, and I just like, for me, again, it's exciting to see people engaging with it in a different and new way.
So I have a two-part question for you now. You have some interesting links on your link tree about book bans and repairs. So what is your take on the recent queer and race book banning in some states' school systems? And what about, I guess, your take on the books that are like nearly destroyed because of maybe poor upkeep, or people have had them for a long time, or maybe some that have been I guess, intentionally destroyed for whatever reason. So, like, what
Yeah.
is your take on those two?
So book banning, I think, is ridiculous, and for me, it's offensive. I personally, I grew up in a very Jewish neighborhood. I'm not Jewish myself, but like, so we learned about the Holocaust very early on. We learned about tolerance. Like, these are things that sort of part of my upbringing were really important. And education and being able to read these stories, whether or not you agree with them, is sort of, your own personal decision. You know what I mean? But like, when it comes to like First Amendment rights, you don't get to tell me or really anybody else what I can and cannot read. Like, I'm not okay with that.
Mm-hmm.
And to restrict what kids have access to, really, like, and for the reasons that they're talking about, it's just absurd. Whether you're talking about race or sexuality or whatever, if you're really serious about that, okay, then you're gonna have to ban the Bible at the end of the day.
Uh-huh.
The Bible, you have, you know what I mean, rape and incest and burning, and, you know what I mean? Like, there's so many topics that they're losing their minds about, but like only if it's dealing with queer representation, or only if it's dealing with, critical race theory. And it's just a targeted way for people to make a big stink about things that they think everybody else should be ashamed about. And that really drives me crazy. Last year when they started the book banning, they banned mouse, and their big, a lot of them, their big controversy over it was they used the word bitch once in the book, and a mouse representation of the author's, I don't know if his mother or his grandmother, was either like in a bra or like partially naked. I forget, like, the exact reasoning. And that was their like, oh, we're going to ban the book for this reason. And I'm like, really? Like, that's what you're going with? Okay. It sort of boggles my mind. They banned a Neil Gaiman book. What is it called? Neverwhere, several years ago, literally because they used the word snogging, because a couple was snogging on a park bench, which, means kissing. And that was it. That was it. That's why they banned the book. And I find that like ridiculous, because again, if you're going to do that, then you're going to have to ban, like all the other books that you like think are okay. Like, I'm not okay with that.
I remember reading, I think it may have been on Twitter or maybe a couple of months ago, about how one parent complained about a graphic novel that their daughter was reading at the school library. And the school had to go and take all of the graphic novels out and pretty much vet them and see what else was in here, in their catalog. So for however many months, this teenage girl couldn't rent out or take any books out of the library. And I think the school library was her only access to books, because, a lot of people can't afford to buy new or even used books. And then a public library may be too far away from her house for her to go to, because, again, she probably doesn't have a driver's license. She probably doesn't have money to take the public transit. So for her to have access to the books are at her school library. So you're just limiting and restricting these kids' access to books in a place where they're supposed to be learning. They're supposed to be having access to stuff. So it just doesn't make any sense at all. So it's just like the book banning that happens, maybe every 20, 25, maybe 30 years, where they keep doing it, and it didn't work then. What makes you think it's going to work now? It just keeps coming back up, maybe like every other generation. It's just I think just another distraction from what we're supposed to be focusing on.
Agreed. And in terms of the comic book industry, particularly book banning, is not new. There's actually a really good graphic novel called Teenagers from Mars, which is about about them trying to arrest. I think they arrest the main character because he's either reading or selling comic books at his store. And for a long time, I don't know if it's still up, but for a long time you had the Comic Book Legal Fund, which literally was there for people that were being that had legal problems because they were either selling or creating comic book art. It honestly, until comic books entered like the movies and the mainstream, they really were sort of at the edges of society, and like people sort of put them on the same level as like the porn industry and sort of would freak out like comic books are evil, graphic novels are evil. So for a long time, and I'm talking up into like the early 2000s, at least the Comic Book Legal Fund was a thing that was there to help people that were being prosecuted for being creators and exercising their constitutional rights.
Yeah. And I think you already brought this up because I thought the second question I asked was, how do you, I guess, feel about books that are nearly destroyed because of poor upkeep and intentionally destroyed? And you brought up, what was it called? Did they paint on the three edges? What was that called again?
Four-edge painting.
Four-edge painting. And I didn't know it had a name, so I thought like, oh, these people are like destroying the books, but actually it's a technique. I didn't know that. Yeah. But how do you feel about people who write in their books?
This is like a long debate about dog earring. That's like another big one that people sort of get very, very hype about. So for me, writing in a book, I like it. I don't do it myself really, but I like seeing them because for me, it speaks to the history of the book, and that this is passed through a couple of different people, and that they have loved this book or really sort of engaged with it enough that they're going to leave their mark. Same with like book plates, like you'll see the stickers. This was the library of, like that stuff I like. Oh, so yeah, you have.
I was like, I hope she doesn't get mad about it, because I wrote, and I had this one book that I was going to review, and I read it, and I completely forgot to do it. But I don't know if you can tell, but I just wrote like,
yeah.
Because I remember in high school, my English class, she was like, it's okay to write your books because, like you said, it tells the history of the people that read it before them. But then because I am a self-published author, that's what I was doing at Baltimore Comic-Con.
Yeah, I remember.
And I remember asking a person, not there, but before, if they wanted me to sign it. And he was like, I don't really like it when people sign books or write in books. I was like, oh, well, you're not going to like me because I write my books.
Well, and it's really like, people are going to like hear this, but it really is sort of wrapped up in the history of books. Monks would take old manuscripts that were falling apart, and they would literally cut them up and use them to line new books. They would line spines with it. So there have been times where, museums have taken a book apart to repair it and found intact, pages of a completely different manuscript inside that might have been more important historically, but like the monks didn't know or care. Recently, this professor found out that he's a professor in like science, and he found out that he has Sir Isaac Newton's personal copy of Sir Isaac Newton's book Optics. And he didn't know. He'd bought it, off an auction or whatever. And then when he realized it, he went through and he saw Sir Isaac Newton's signature and like notes. Like, that's cool, you know what I mean? But you won't know those things unless people write in the book. So I'm a proponent. I think it's cool. But yeah, I know a lot of people get upset about it. So
well, throughout the whole process of you doing your book binding, book repair, doing a commission for someone or whatever it may be, do you or did you ever at some point get overwhelmed with it all? Did it, or does it ever become too much? And how do you typically manage your mental well-being when it does?
Yeah, sure. I mean, like there are times, so, book binding can be like a lengthy process. There are times when you're letting glue cure like overnight. So like that's 12 hours, and if there's other things going on, not only in your life personally, but with the clients, they have deadlines, they have due dates, they have birthday gifts, like whatever it is. You want to deliver, but you also, want to make sure that the book is done correctly. And I think most bookbinders have multiple projects on their bench at any given moment. Like there's usually a stack of books in some, form or another. And so, for us, it's a lot of it is our own time management. But honestly, for me, the bookbinding is my mental health, like sort of self-care.
Mm-hmm.
I just personality wise, like I sort of run at 1,000,000 miles an hour, and I'm like a very busy person, and that I'm typically very happy that way. But, when my life gets overwhelming, I go back to my bench. That's where like okay, you have to slow down here, and you have to take a break, and you have to go slow because it's not going to work otherwise. And so bookbinding for me is my mental self-care. And I really, there's something really soothing in it. Whether that's like folding pages or sewing or gluing things or designing, like whatever sort of part of the process I'm at, like I find it for the most part like really restful. And I really like it. So
So my last question for you, Liz, is what advice would you offer to other, I guess, crafts people? It can be just crafts in general, it can be someone who wants to get into bookbinding, book repairs, maybe even art conservation, whatever it may be. So like, just what advice would you offer to someone that you wish someone would have told you when you first started?
Well, the first thing that like I do want to like say to anybody interested, there are like a million resources for bookbinding. There is regardless of sort of like the country you're in, there are like professional trade organizations. In the United States is the Guild of Bookworkers. There's one in Canada, Society of Bookworkers. In Great Britain, a Society of Bookbinders. And there are strong like bookbinding communities like all over the place. There's Belgium and Japan, and there's one in Russia, there's New Zealand and Australia. Like you'll find us sort of everywhere. We're everywhere. And with the web, it's really nice because you can sort of reach out across international lines and ask questions and find tools or find materials that are otherwise sort of difficult to find. But the big thing for me about the bookbinding community is honestly like how welcoming and excited they are. Like you have a book question and they're like, yes, come talk to us. Like we are here. And there's sort of like, there was for a while a big generational gap. So a lot of bookbinders are sort of very much in the late stages of their career. Like they've been doing this for like 40, 50 years. And there's like a sort of a gap. So like a lot of the newer bookbinders have only been doing this for like 5 to 10, you know what I mean? And I think that sort of when that sort of the newer generation came in, the older generation was just like, hey, thank God, but also, these people their biggest interests are about books and paper and leather, and like they really just want to talk to you about it. They will happily answer questions. They're extremely welcoming. They're extremely interesting. They have the craziest stories, and they have like the craziest tools. Like they are using tools that are 100 years old, and that doesn't break. And if they can't find the tool, they will learn to make it, or they will steal it from another industry, and then they'll show you how to make it yourself. In school, I learned how to make my own knives, and I learned how to make my own finishing tools to make the really crazy fancy gold work. Like we learned those skills. And then I sent pictures back to my friends, and they're like, so you learned to make shanks and what I was like, little. But yeah, like these people are just they're passionate and they're excited to share their passion. And I don't think I've ever really had a bad experience, in the community.
So. Well, I kind of learned how to make my own shank too when I was in college, but
that's a different story.
It's a different story. Well, as you were talking about how like people have been doing this for a long time in the generation gap, and then like they're dealing with materials that have been around for like hundreds of years, right? Can book binding be done by a machine, or can it only really be done by hand?
Oh no, absolutely, it can be done by machine. And
Okay.
if you look at the history like of book binding, so you'll see sort of like it aligns with like advances in the industry. A lot of hardcover books that you buy today are machine sewn, and then their spine is glued, and then the covers are put on or whatever. Graphic novels and manga typically are they're not sewn at all. They're sort of chopped at the spine, and then put through a machine that puts like a really thick layer of glue on them, and that's sort of like how they're assembled. So yeah, like most books today are definitely not hand bound, but like really the difference is that, like as with most like modern things, they're because they're assembled this way, they're not built to last. And that goes from like the paper quality up to like the sewing and the glues. Like some of the glues that they use are so acidic it will literally over time eat the paper. That's just it's the cheapest way of doing things. So when you have bookbinders taking these books and doing repairs, and like one of the reasons like I'll stabilize a spine, or when I make a cover, like almost all of my products that I use are like acid free, for the purpose of like this, like I want this to last for you. You know what I mean? You're paying money for it. Like I want it to be in your family for a while. And so yeah, so that's like a big difference between like sort of the industrial machine and local bookbinders.
Because when you were talking and describing it to me, and that gap, I was like, oh, it must be just a lot of people, just it might have been like a dying art or craft in a way. And I was wondering, oh, can it only be done by hand? Is it better to have it by hand? What you just said, it lasts longer when it's done by hand because of the materials that are used. And I guess because it being a lot of books being produced, it's easier to have it done by a machine. But like you said, it lasts longer when it's done by hand. And I remember learning, I think it was like on TikTok of all places, that crocheting can only be done by hand because of a machine can't repeat the pattern of something. So I was thinking, oh, there's something that must be better about it being done by hand versus it being done by machine. And like you said, the types of materials that are used, it lasts a lot longer. So if anybody's looking out there to have a book repaired or bound, there you go. It lasts longer. It may be more money, but it lasts longer. So you don't have to worry about going back and getting it redone.
Yeah, and most people come to bookbinders now. They're coming with like their sentimental projects. So they're coming with their family Bibles and their grandma's cookbook that has been falling apart, and their kids' books and that kind of thing, which is wonderful. Like most of them can be repaired, absolutely. But I guess like the big part of my business is like you can come to me with your favorite book, and you can come to me with your fan favorite, like this is your thing, and I'm gonna make it look awesome for you, and that's what I want to do. I like, I'm a fan too, so like I want to help you with that, and that's what makes me excited about the art. So,
well, is there anything that you want to touch on about the shadow bindery as a whole that I may have missed, or anything else about your Etsy shop that you mentioned, or anything else?
I'm going to be at the Philadelphia Fan Expo this upcoming June. So I'm trying to get out to a couple more Comic-Cons this year. That's the first one I'm going to go to. So if you're there, come see me. I'll be in Artist Alley. But yeah, like if you have any questions, like even if you're just curious, like I said, I this is my thing. So I'm happy to talk to people about it. And yeah, reach out. I'm here.
Well, do you typically do a big cons, or do you do smaller things? Because I've learned to do smaller stuff. Like Baltimore Comic-Con was like $350 for that whole weekend for that table, and it was harder to make my money back because of how much the table cost, and then how much the books I was selling. I'm not a really big vendor, and that was my first time doing a big Comic-Con. But then I started doing smaller stuff. They're like further out in Maryland. They may be in the middle of nowhere in Maryland, Glen Burnie, Laurel, whatever it may be. And I was actually making more money. I mean, the table wasn't as expensive, but you'd be surprised how, when you go to these places in the middle of nowhere, that there are people there that are interested in your work and are willing to pay the money, like even in cash, because they don't really have stuff like that out there like they would in the city.
Yeah. And I've actually talked to a bunch of vendors, and they've like sort of said the same thing to me, especially for like Artist Alley and indie authors, like they're heading to the smaller cons because they're getting a better return. And also like the art festivals and like the fall festivals, that kind of thing. Like you, this is like sort of my first go round. So I'm sort of still exploring and trying to get into see where I'm going to make my money. But for sure, I've found that like longer cons or the bigger cons, because people say and they think like, oh, I'll come back in like a couple of days, and then they spend their money elsewhere. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Which I get. There's a lot of cool stuff out there. But in the smaller cons, like it's either one day or maybe two. Like it's either get it now or you're not going to get it at all. And people will, sort of make that impulse buy a little bit faster, or they have that money and they're like, okay, I want this now. So yes, it's like you, it's something I'm starting to figure out and trying to navigate.
Yeah. And I've also been telling people, I don't mean to make this about myself,
No,
but
not at all.
I've also been telling people to kind of stay or explore their local network with stuff. So well, locally to me is different from local to someone who's from like Idaho. Someone told me that. They're like, oh, I'm from Idaho, and local stuff is what's here, and then the next town over is like an hour away. Whereas some here in Baltimore City, you're here in the city, there's a lot of people, and then you can go out to the county, which is like maybe, depending on where you live, it can be like 15, 20 minutes away. And then Glen Burnie is like 45 minutes away. I went to Ocean City, Maryland, which is like, I think 2 hours away, is really like down the road from Delaware. But there's a lot of different places and that you can go to here locally. Whereas in Idaho, like she said, the next town is an hour away over. And I was just telling her, somebody, you may not know them yet or realize that you do, but they've been to the next town over an hour away and they know how it works. You just kind of have to, like I said, explore, and ask around. And that may mean that you have to, I know a lot of us introverts are really scared to do this, but you have to initiate conversation and introduce yourself and put yourself out there and really just ask the questions like, hey, have you been here? Hey, how long have you been doing this? Can you give me some advice or whatever it may be? And don't be afraid that, oh, they'll be mean or an asshole to me or anything like that. It's like, well, if they're an asshole to you, they're just an asshole. Then you have to move on to somebody else. You just have to learn how to deal with it.
Yeah. No, and honestly, I don't know about your experience, but like I found the Artist Alley people to be really awesome. And there's a couple really great groups like on Facebook that are like Artist Alley specific, or even like indie authors that like, these people will join the group and they sort of exchange information. And like, I've gone on the group and asked questions. I've seen other people ask questions that I was like, oh crap, I didn't know that. Like, good to know. And yeah, it's sort of like this really great opportunity to network and sort of learn ahead of time. And there was a couple of things that like I learned on that group, like, you wouldn't even think about it, but like phone charger, like you're there for like 12 hours a day or whatever, 3 days in a row, your phone's going to die. You know what I mean? And I would never have thought about that if they hadn't pointed that. I'm like, oh crap, I got to make sure that like I have some sort of, phone charger that I can carry with me. Like, okay. So yeah, you're right. Like it's really important to sort of network and find your people and reach out to these groups. They really are a great resource.
And if you're thinking about coming back to Baltimore Comic Con, I was telling people parking, you can actually park at the Oriole Stadium, which is at the top of the block. You can park there for free. Actually.
Oh wow.
Not on Friday because it's during the work week, but on Saturday and Sunday, as long as they're not a game that's there or an event like a marathon, anything like that, you can park there for free.
Yeah. So, I got an Airbnb specifically with parking because I was like worried about it. And and then I ended up like walking, to the con and that was fine for me. But yeah, I was worried about parking. I was like, oh, I'm just gonna make sure that this is included.
Yeah, they had a deal included. I guess the the organizers had a deal with the one at the be an old railroad museum up the road. But I was like, that's too far. I can just park at the stadium, which I did,
Yeah.
and just walk straight down like maybe 2 blocks. I'm not sure. Yeah, but
Yeah.
it's actually free. So I don't know where the Philadelphia convention is going to be at, but
It's in the
it,
convention center, and which
mhm.
for Philly is literally across the street from one of the major train stops. So whether you're sort of getting a hotel in the city, which is a pretty walkable city, or if you decide to stay outside of the city in the suburbs, like you literally just take the train in and you hop off at that stop and you walk across the street. Or, there's, depending on, which line you're on, it'll come up underneath. So yeah, like for Philly, it's right there, and
Mhm.
really accessible, which is nice.
Okay, cool.
Yeah.
All right. I kind of just took this away from you. Is there anything else that you wanted to discuss before we end, Liz?
I don't think so. No, this has been a lot of fun.
Okay, cool. Well, all right. Again, I want to thank the craftsman behind the Shadow Bindery, Elizabeth McHugh, for joining us here today to discuss her specialties in book binding and book repairs. All of Liz's socials and Linktree will be listed in this episode's details for those who are interested in her work and reading some of the articles she's posted that I mentioned earlier. Again, I'm KS Garner, and you've been listening to the Solo Nerdbird podcast. Thank you.
Thanks.